Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're diving into the world of Jeffrey Dahmer.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, a chilling story for sure, but we're going to try and unpack it a bit.
Okay.
We've got some excerpts from a text that explores not just Dahmer's crimes, but also the psychological factors that may have, that may have contributed to him becoming one of America's most notorious serial killers.
Yeah.
And, one thing that really stuck out to me, and I'll be interested to get your take on it, was that Dahmer had an unusual fascination with bones, even at 4 years old.
That's right. It's you think about it, it seems innocent enough at first, but when you think about it in the context of his later crimes, it's almost like a foreshadowing.
Yeah, it's creepy. So
Almost.
let's rewind back to the beginning. Dahmer was born in Milwaukee in 1960. What was his childhood like?
Well, let's just say it wasn't exactly a happy childhood. His father, Lionel, was a workaholic chemist and often absent, and his mom, Joyce, she struggled with mental health issues. Yeah, she battled depression, anxiety, and she was using prescription medication even while she was pregnant with Jeffrey.
Oh, wow.
So, not exactly this stable home environment.
And that lack of stability, did that continue throughout his childhood?
It did, unfortunately. And one thing that really stands out um, that we found in the text was Dahmer's early interest in dissecting animals.
I mean, a lot of kids are curious about anatomy, but with Dahmer, was it different?
It seemed to go beyond just curiosity. It was this fascination with death. He almost had this need to understand it, this need to control it.
And that need for control, that's something that we're going to see play out again and again in his life, unfortunately. So his teenage years weren't any easier, right?
No, not at all. I mean, adolescence is tough for a lot of kids, but Dahmer had it particularly rough. He was bullied relentlessly. He became very isolated, withdrawn.
Hmm.
And then on top of that, when he was 18, his parents got divorced, both of them moving on pretty quickly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you can imagine the feelings of abandonment.
Oh, absolutely.
Just when he's already struggling to find his place in the world.
And how did he cope with all that?
Alcohol. He turned to alcohol.
Hmm.
He was using it to numb the pain, to escape his problems.
Yeah.
He even tried to join the army, hoping for some structure, maybe some discipline.
Oh, right.
But his drinking continued, and he was eventually discharged in 1981.
So another attempt at a normal life fails. Where did he go from there?
He moved around a bit, lived with his grandmother for a while. He was trying for some sense of normalcy.
Okay.
But underneath it all, his past, his dark impulses, they were festering. And then in 1978, at 18, he crossed a line. He committed his first murder.
This is Stephen Hicks, right?
Yes, Stephen Hicks.
So can you tell us a little bit about what happened?
Dahmer picked him up hitchhiking,
Right.
invited him back to his family's empty house for a beer. And when Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer, feeling rejected, he flew into a rage. He bludgeoned Hicks with a dumbbell, then he strangled him and dismembered the body.
God. It's just horrifying to think about. A seemingly minor trigger, this perceived rejection, unleashed such violence.
It's truly disturbing, and unfortunately, it seems that this act unleashed a darkness that he could not control.
And did this pattern continue?
Sadly, it did. Even though he tried to live a normal life with his grandmother in Wisconsin, his behavior got increasingly more erratic. He was even arrested for indecent exposure and had some pretty disturbing collections of animal bones.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But even with these warning signs, it's chilling to think his second murder wouldn't occur for another 9 years.
And this time, it was in his grandmother's home,
Exactly.
despite her efforts to provide him with a stable environment.
It's tragic, really. The murder in Catherine's house was the turning point that forced her to really confront the reality of her grandson. For Dahmer, it was a further descent into a pattern of brutal, depraved crimes.
Yeah. And what sets his crimes apart, well, aside from the obvious, is the meticulous way that he went about them. Almost like he had a very specific victim in mind, a particular type that he was seeking out.
You're absolutely right. His modus operandi was disturbingly calculated. He primarily targeted men and boys, a lot of times from gay bars. He used charm, promises of money, drugs, alcohol to lure them back to his apartment.
But these substances, they weren't just for pleasure, were they? He was using them to incapacitate his victims
Exactly. He would drug them.
as part of his plan.
Yeah. Often with halcyon, sleeping pills, and then he would strangle them. But the horror didn't end there.
No, we're talking about necrophilia, the dismemberment, even cannibalism.
Yeah.
It's difficult to even fathom.
For Dahmer, the killings were about more than just taking a life. They were about control, dominance, and this perverse fascination with the human body.
So his Milwaukee apartment, That became a really macabre scene,
A gruesome testament to his obsessions.
filled with preserved body parts, skulls, photographs.
It was this stark contrast to the facade of normalcy he tried to maintain.
Yeah, a terrifying double life. And, what's even more disturbing is that he almost got away with it for so long. He even managed to manipulate the police on several occasions.
You're right. One of the most tragic examples of this manipulation was the case of Konorak Synthesymphone, a 14-year-old boy.
He escaped.
He managed to escape from Dahmer's apartment in 1991.
He escaped Dahmer's apartment. What happened?
He did. Drugged, assaulted, but he was able to flee the apartment. And he was found wandering the streets, disoriented and injured, even flagged down a patrol car.
So the police were finally alerted.
You would think so, but tragically, it wasn't the end of his ordeal.
What do you mean? What happened?
Well, Dahmer, he convinced the officers that Synthesome was actually his adult boyfriend, and they didn't investigate properly. Influenced by racial bias and homophobia, they actually returned the boy to Dahmer's apartment.
That is just... It makes me sick. A young boy crying for help.
Oh.
And no one listened because of prejudice and assumptions. It's a stark reminder of the systemic failures that allowed Dahmer to continue.
Absolutely. It's a horrifying example of how societal biases can have devastating consequences. It's a reminder of the vulnerability of marginalized communities.
Yeah.
But there's another chilling aspect of Dahmer's crimes that we need to discuss. The zombie experiment.
Yes, I read about that. It's hard to believe that he actually tried to create zombies.
It almost is unbelievable, but Dahmer did attempt to do that. He would drill into his victims' skulls while they were still alive, and he'd inject substances like acid or boiling water. He was attempting to lobotomize them.
I don't even have words for how evil that is.
It's one of the most disturbing elements of his crimes. It wasn't simply about killing, it was about this control, this dominance, possessing and manipulating his victims even after death.
This brings up a crucial question, though. What was going on in his mind? What kind of thinking could lead him to believe this zombie experiment would actually work?
Yeah, it's a question that has haunted psychologists and criminologists for decades. It's a chilling glimpse into the potential for darkness that exists within us all.
It's terrifying. But thankfully, his reign of terror did eventually end. How did it all fall apart for Dahmer?
Ironically, it ended thanks to the same man who had been failed by the system just a few months earlier, Tracy Edwards.
You mean the young man who had escaped Dahmer's apartment and was returned to him by the police?
That's right. He escaped again.
He escaped again.
He did. He was drugged and assaulted, but this time he managed to break free from Dahmer's apartment and flag down a patrol car.
Wow. Talk about a second chance. So this time the police believed him.
They did. This time they went back to the apartment with him, and what they found was a scene straight out of a horror movie.
What did they find?
They found a freezer full of human heads,
Oh, my God.
a drum filled with dissolving bodies in the bedroom, and countless photographs documenting Dahmer's crimes. It was a horrifying discovery.
It's hard to even imagine the terror those officers must have felt.
Yeah.
So then what? Did he run? Did he fight?
He surrendered without a fight. He even confessed to everything.
Wow.
Sitting with police, he detailed each of his 17 murders, calmly recalling names, dates, methods. He described his acts like he was recounting a grocery list.
It's that calmness in the face of such horrific acts.
It's truly disturbing.
That must have been even more disturbing than the crimes themselves.
It's a chilling example of the disconnect that can exist between outward demeanor and internal landscape, especially in cases of psychopathy. His composure really highlights this profound lack of empathy and remorse.
So what happened next? Was he put on trial?
It was a media frenzy. The whole world was watching. Dahmer pleaded guilty but insane, hoping to avoid responsibility for his actions.
And did it work?
Not at all.
Okay.
His psychopathy, his clear recollection of his crimes, it all proved that he was completely aware of what he was doing. The jury found him legally sane, and he was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences. Justice was served.
So with Dahmer behind bars, did the story end there?
Not quite. His case continued to captivate and horrify the public. He gave interviews from prison, attempting to explain his actions, often cited his troubled upbringing, mental health issues. But even then, there was a distinct lack of genuine remorse.
That's an interesting point.
It's like he understood that his actions were wrong, but he couldn't fully grasp the emotional weight of the suffering he had caused.
It raises more questions than answers.
It certainly does. And that's what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive. We'll delve further into the psychological complexities of Dahmer's case, examine his lasting impact on society, We'll also look at the ways his story has been told and retold, and what that says about our own fascination with true crime.
This is heavy stuff, folks. But it's a story that needs to be told, needs to be understood. We'll be back soon to continue our exploration.
Absolutely.
We're back, and wow, this is some heavy stuff, diving into the details of Dahmer's crimes. But I think it's important to go beyond just the what and try to understand the why. What factors contributed to this transformation into a serial killer?
Well, during his trial and evaluations, Dahmer was diagnosed with several mental disorders: borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, necrophilia.
Right.
Now, it's important to remember these diagnoses don't automatically make someone a murderer.
No, of course not.
Most people with these disorders aren't violent, but in Dahmer's case, these conditions, combined with other factors, likely played a role.
Okay, so that makes sense. Can you break those down for me a little bit? I have to admit, I'm not super familiar with all of those.
Yeah.
How might they have, manifested in his behavior?
Sure. Let's start with borderline personality disorder, often characterized by intense emotional swings, fear of abandonment, unstable relationships.
Okay.
This could explain Dahmer's extreme reactions to perceived rejection, like we saw with Stephen Hicks. It also kind of lines up with his difficulty forming genuine connections, his reliance on manipulation and control.
So that desperate need for control, the inability to cope with strong emotions, it all starts to connect.
Exactly. Then there's antisocial personality disorder,
Yeah.
often associated with a disregard for social norms, lack of empathy, a tendency for risky behavior, criminal behavior.
Right, so that clearly aligns with, his disregard for human life, his lack of remorse.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's necrophilia,
Yeah.
sexual attraction to corpses.
Right, and how does that specific paraphilia manifest in his crimes? How does that connect with his broader psychological profile?
That's a great question. It's a complex and disturbing condition. And in Dahmer's case, it was really intertwined with his need for control, his distorted view of relationships. For him, necrophilia wasn't just about sexual gratification. It was about possessing and dominating his victims completely, even after death. It was a way to exert ultimate control, eliminate the possibility of rejection or abandonment.
God, that's chilling. So it seems like all of these disorders, combined with his really troubled upbringing, kind of created a perfect storm. But we also have to consider the social context, right? I mean, his crimes occurred during a time when homophobia was rampant.
Absolutely.
He preyed on gay men, many of whom were marginalized, afraid to report to the police.
Societal factors played a huge role in his ability to operate undetected for so long. His victims, often men of color, they were marginalized. They faced prejudice and discrimination. Many were reluctant to go to the police for fear of further victimization or being outed to their families.
It's heartbreaking to think about how vulnerable they were and how Dahmer exploited that.
It is, and let's not forget the systemic failures we talked about. The case of Conorak's synthesomphone, the police prejudice, the missed opportunities to intervene, all of these factors allowed Dahmer to continue.
It's a reminder that we can't just focus on the individual. We have to look at the bigger picture, the social structures that allow these things to happen.
Absolutely. It's this complex interplay of individual psychology and societal context. And it's that complexity that continues to fascinate and horrify people.
Speaking of fascination, Dahmer's legacy continues to capture public attention.
It does.
It's been over 30 years since his crimes, yet he remains a source of morbid fascination. Why do you think that is?
That's a question that's puzzled a lot of people. I think part of it is the sheer horror of his crimes, the depravity, the cruelty. It challenges our understanding of human nature. His acts tap into a primal fear, a darkness that we perhaps all recognize on some level.
Like the boogeyman under the bed,
Yeah.
but brought to life.
Exactly. But it's more than just shock value. I think there's this morbid curiosity about the potential for evil lurking beneath a seemingly ordinary exterior. Dahmer was, on the surface, unremarkable. He blended in, and that's what makes it so terrifying. It makes us wonder, could someone like that live next door to me?
Right. Could I be deceived?
Exactly.
And the recent Netflix series has obviously brought Dahmer back into the spotlight.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? Do these portrayals of true crime, do they serve a purpose? Or are they just exploiting tragedy for entertainment?
It's tricky. I think it's important to be cautious. There's a fine line between exploring these cases in a way that promotes understanding and exploiting them for sensationalism. We have to be mindful of the victims, their families. We need to avoid glorifying the perpetrators.
Yeah, it's not just a story. It's people's lives, their pain, their trauma, and we have a responsibility to treat those stories with respect.
Absolutely. And I think that brings us to a really crucial question. What lessons can we learn from Dahmer's case? What can we do to prevent something like this from happening again?
That's the question that's been on my mind this whole time. It feels almost overwhelming. Like, where do we even begin?
It's true, there are no easy answers. But I think it starts with a shared sense of responsibility. We can't just rely on law enforcement or mental health professionals. It requires a collective effort.
So what can we do? What specific actions can we take?
One crucial area is mental health awareness and access to care. We need to encourage open conversations, challenge the stigma, and make sure resources are available. Early intervention and ongoing treatment can make a world of difference.
But what about the people who don't recognize that they need help or are afraid to ask for it? How do we reach them?
That's where community support is so vital. We need to create environments where people feel safe sharing their struggles, reaching out for help. Without judgment, we can all play a role in this by educating ourselves, recognizing warning signs, offering support.
So it's about looking out for one another, understanding that mental health is just as important as physical health.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the role of law enforcement. We need to hold them accountable, address prejudice and bias, ensure they're trained to recognize and respond to potential threats, especially within marginalized communities.
It's about creating a society where everyone feels safe and protected, regardless of sexual orientation, race, background.
Precisely. Dahmer's case is a stark reminder of what can happen when we fail to do that. But while his story is filled with darkness, there is a glimmer of hope. By learning from the past, confronting our own biases, working together to create a more just and equitable society, we can honor the victims and hopefully prevent future tragedies.
That's a powerful message, and one we must never forget. We're back, and this is the final part of our deep dive into Jeffrey Dahmer. It's been heavy, exploring this dark side of human nature.
It has. But there's value in confronting these tough topics, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think by understanding these complexities, we can learn and hopefully work towards preventing these horrors in the future.
I agree.
And as we wrap up, it's really important to remember the victims. Their stories are often overshadowed by, Dahmer's notoriety.
You're right. Each of his victims was an individual with hopes and dreams, loved ones. Their lives were cut short, and we need to remember them not just as victims, but as the unique people they were.
It's so easy to get caught up in the psychology of the killer, the why of it all. How do we shift that focus back to the victims without, sensationalizing the crimes or giving Dahmer more attention?
It's a tough balance. I think by focusing on their lives before they cross paths with Dahmer, their passions, relationships, the impact they had.
It's about painting a full picture, showing they were so much more than just victims, sons, brothers, friends. Their stories deserve to be told.
Exactly. And we need to acknowledge the ripple effects, too. The families, the communities he devastated, they still grapple with the pain and loss. Their stories are part of his legacy as well.
Yeah, the trauma doesn't just end with Dahmer's capture.
It leaves lasting scars.
On individuals, families, communities.
That's why ongoing support is so important. Counseling, resources, a sense of justice. True justice isn't just about punishing the perpetrator. It's about healing, restoring balance, honoring the memories of those we've lost.
That brings us to the question that's really been at the forefront of my mind during this whole thing. What can we do to prevent these tragedies from happening again?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
It feels overwhelming, but I think it starts with shared responsibility. We can't just rely on law enforcement or mental health professionals. It takes all of us.
So where do we even begin? What steps can we take?
I think first, challenging our own biases, the assumptions we make about others based on race, sexual orientation, gender, socioeconomic status. These biases have consequences.
Yeah, the way the police dismissed concerns about Dahmer's behavior because of his victim's race and sexual orientation. That's a perfect example.
Exactly. It's about educating ourselves, listening to marginalized voices, creating a more inclusive society where everyone feels safe and valued.
It comes down to empathy.
It really does.
Recognizing the humanity in everyone.
And speaking out against injustice, even when it's uncomfortable. Silence only allows these problems to fester. We have to hold each other accountable.
So education, empathy, and action.
Yes.
And let's not forget mental health awareness.
Absolutely. Break down the stigma, encourage people to seek help, ensure access to resources.
Mental health is just as important as physical health.
Exactly. And finally, I think fostering a sense of community, creating spaces where people feel connected, supported, where they can reach out for help without fear.
Because isolation can be a breeding ground.
It can. Connection can be a powerful force for good.
I think that's a great place to end.
I agree.
This has been a really challenging but incredibly important deep dive. If you take away anything from this conversation, we hope it's a sense of shared responsibility, a commitment to, challenging our own biases, and a renewed focus on creating a safer, more just world.
Change starts with us.
Thanks for joining us. We encourage you to continue exploring these issues and to take action in your own communities. Until next time, keep diving deep.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Make sure to subscribe and like this video for more stories that will keep you awake at night. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss a tale of terror.